Hello, my name is Will Evans, and I'm here for Aphasia Games for Health to talk about rehab principles and design considerations from the perspective of speech language pathology. So, outline. First, we'll talk a little bit about what is aphasia and talk about its real world impact. Then, we'll talk about aphasia rehabilitation from a speech language pathology perspective. Talk a little bit about common treatment goals and typical aphasia treatment approaches. Then we'll apply these approaches and principles to game design for aphasia games for health, focusing on some kind of core behavioral parameters, and then talking about a number of additional kind of principles, active ingredients, and design considerations. Finally, I'll close by talking through a few different kind of case examples, both language-based games for neurotypical individuals and also a couple examples of existing aphasia treatments. All right, let's get started. So, aphasia is a language disorder caused by acquired brain injury, usually to the left hemisphere. There are at least 2.5 million people with aphasia living in the United States, resulting from stroke, traumatic brain injury, or brain tumor. And aphasia has negatively affects the long-term quality of life. It leads to social isolation, and people with aphasia have much higher rates of depression and anxiety, even compared to stroke survivors who don't have aphasia. Finally, there's very low public awareness of aphasia and lack of long-term services available. So Aphasia Games for Health is an exciting way to help this underserved population. A little bit more about aphasia. So it's a disorder of language caused by brain damage, usually to the left hemisphere. And it can affect talking, listening comprehension, writing, or reading. It can affect people with aphasia can have difficulties in pretty much any area of language. So this is just kind of one schematic to think through the different pieces of language. Spoken language versus written language, listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And that there's different levels of the language system. There's phonology, thinking about the sound level of language. Morphology, thinking about things like verb tenses. Syntax, how word order affects meaning. And also semantics, meaning itself. And so for people with aphasia, they can have deficits at any level of language like that, and also in terms of input, so understanding, getting a message in, so comprehension, and output, so what they can produce, whether it's spoken or written. So if you're trying to understand the language profile of somebody who has aphasia, you might ask questions like this. So can they understand, on the input side, single words, sentences? Could they read a book? Could they understand rapid ongoing conversation? On the output side, could they produce single words? Can they produce sentences, written paragraphs? Could they provide a monologue telling you what happened to them yesterday? A really important thing for us to keep in mind here is that aphasia profiles are highly variable and individualized. So every person with aphasia has their own unique language profile. Many people with aphasia have deficits across the board, or they might have deficits in only one or two areas. Sometimes you'll see kind of relative strengths and weaknesses, so deficits may be very mild in some areas and severe in others. So somebody might have mild comprehension deficits, but very severe verbal production deficits. Or things could be mild or severe across the board. So for us, to make fun and engaging games for the aphasia community in general, it's really important to take this huge amount of individual variability into account. And if you have the slides, I've just provided a couple examples here where you could look at interviews for two different people with aphasia who have very, very different language profiles. Now, we've been talking about the language system, but the language deficits themselves are only one part of actually living with aphasia. And so for us, the question is, how well do language ability, beliefs, and attitude match an individual's environment and communication needs? So this whole idea of living with aphasia is affected by all these factors. And so examples of life participation factors would be an individual's life roles, their responsibilities, their activities of choice. So does somebody with aphasia still need to serve as the primary breadwinner for their family? Were they always the person who advocated for their child at school? These things will have a big effect on the consequences of their aphasia. Person level factors are things like attitude, beliefs, overall mental health. And so thinking about somebody who's having a difficult moment of communication, do they respond to that with shame, increased depression, anxiety, fighting perfectionism over and over again? Or can they respond to that with resilience, humor, humility, right? Responding at that kind of person level, one way versus the other will have a huge impact on the consequence of that difficulty. And the communication environments that they're trying to participate in make a huge difference as well. So the physical, social environment, how noisy things are, the interaction context. And so there's a huge difference between a loud family gathering where everybody laughs and is used to talking all over each other and jumping right in, you can't get a word in edgewise, compared to a small support group where people have actually really learned to give each other space to provide the time that each individual needs. Again, the consequence of these language deficits will be totally different, and the experience of living with aphasia will be different as well. And so you can see how all these things together really affect the ability to satisfy basic human needs. One framework I really like for thinking about basic human needs comes from self-determination theory of motivation. And here the claim is that across cultures, human beings have three profoundly fundamental psychological needs. The need for autonomy, so that's the ability to act in accordance with their own values and wishes. The feeling that their actions are volitional in some way, or at least consistent with their values. The need to feel competent, so to feel effective, the ability to master challenges and interact successfully with the environment. A key thing here is that to really feel like feelings of competence are satisfied, the tasks where people experience mastery have to be meaningful to them. And then another basic need is relatedness, so the being able to feel connected to others. As you can imagine, aphasia challenges competence, autonomy, and can make it very hard to connect. So what I want us to be thinking about is well-designed aphasia games for health could address these basic needs. So again, my contribution to the project is really thinking as a speech-language pathologist and aphasia rehabilitation researcher. And so treatment goals from a SLP perspective, we try to help people with aphasia restore lost language. And so we might help, based on what their goals, what they tell us they need, we might try to help them target specific difficulties in reading, writing, understanding, speaking, maybe issues with numeracy, etc. We also help try to improve compensatory communication skills. And so people with aphasia can definitely restore aspects of language. It tends to be slow. It tends to be frustrating. Often people can't make the types of gains they're hoping to make quickly, but they can restore language. But if we just left it there, we wouldn't help people as much as we could. So there's a lot to be gained by finding ways to help people adapt, helping them learn strategies, and helping them kind of reframe this whole communication process. So one of the things we talk about a lot is that communication is the goal, not one particular way to express a message. So if that word, it's in their head, but it's not just coming out, there might still be another way to express something that they care about. And then another goal. So again, because we have this whole large model of living with aphasia and all the things that affect that, is SLPs help people with aphasia address barriers to communication. So, they could be linguistic barriers, environmental barriers, or psychosocial barriers. And the idea is that a lot more can be done to help people with aphasia than just focusing on language deficits in isolation. And so we're hoping that all of these possibilities will inform our designs for Aphasia Games for Health. So those are the treatment goals, so the what. Moving on to the how. So how do we help people with aphasia respond to their language deficits? And so one major approach is restorative treatment. So trying to help directly improve language function via drilling, structured therapy, lots of repetition and practice. Also compensatory treatment. So that might be doing things like training self-cueing strategies, other communication strategies, and not just for people with aphasia, but for their communication partners as well. If you can understand what somebody with aphasia needs to communicate, there's really ways to help reveal their competence and really change that communication interaction. Another types of treatment was counseling or providing other types of emotional support. And we've learned that it's really important to address the emotional impact of aphasia. And if we can help promote psychological flexibility and resilience, people can be more motivated for long-term recovery, and the consequences of living with aphasia doesn't have to mean the same thing. We also focus on education goals. So helping people with aphasia and their caregivers understand how aphasia works, what does or doesn't work for that individual specifically is really empowering. It gives them a lot of options and flexibility. And more generally, that type of education is empowering for aphasia advocacy as well, because I mentioned that this disorder, despite how common it is really unknown. So, current aphasia treatments are very well aligned with Aphasia Games for Health. So there's some exciting developing work where people are looking at things like brain stimulation or doing behavioral treatment with the addition of drug trials. But in general, standard aphasia treatments and current clinical practice are all behavioral, right? So it's drilling, training, education. By interacting, we're seeking to change behavior and ability. And the reason behind that is it's been shown to be effective. The right behavioral treatments promote adaptation and can restore lost function by promoting state-dependent neuroplasticity. And so acquired brain injury is what causes aphasia in the first place. But what we've started to learn is that direct practice the right way with the right focus can lead directly to changes in neural function as well. This is great news for Aphasia Games for Health because games are excellent ways to shape behavior and they can offer excellent practice contexts. So that's kind of a run through about what aphasia is, main treatment targets and treatment approaches. And so now we're trying to shift over and think about how that applies to Aphasia Games for Health. So in general, this area is wide open for exploration. Lots of exciting stuff. It's hopefully going to start happening. Things like game adaptation and development, tons of directions. But for us, for our summer 2020 prototyping, we need to narrow things down. And so we're hoping to develop fun new games that do the following things. Are playable by the aphasia community through video teleconferencing software, This is to maximize access to these games during COVID-19, but also well beyond that. This is because many people with aphasia are isolated. Many have concomitant mobility impairments like hemiparesis and lots of difficulties with transportation. So if we can make games that people can play through video teleconferencing, they'll be much more accessible. We also want to develop games that have one or more clear therapeutic goals. Our whole tagline is we want to help people with aphasia to continue to improve and connect. And so we definitely want games designed to address language deficits and or the negative consequences of living with aphasia in some intentional way. And ideally, we want these games to be playable without the support of SLPs or other licensed healthcare professionals. The rationale here is that healthcare services for aphasia are very limited in short term, but people with aphasia have the ability to improve for years after treatment typically runs out. So one of the whole ideas behind this project is we want to develop and offer evidence-based options to promote long-term recovery that really supports the communities that already exists and can thrive outside the standard medical model. For these prototypes, we're going to really want to focus on some core design ingredients. And so most effective behavioral aphasia treatments include the following. Provide repeated practice with clear intent, provide performance feedback, and they adjust task difficulty over time to maintain desirable difficulty. For us, we want to incorporate each of these ingredients into Aphasia Games for Health. So, repeated practice with clear intent. For skill learning or performance improvements to be maintained long term, lots of practice is required. This practice is also required past the point of initial mastery. So what that means is that somebody's practicing and they get better at something. They show that, oh, look, they can name these pictures again. They can produce that kind of language. If you stop right when they're starting to be able to do it, what we'll often find in the research is you come back a month or two later and most of the gains have been lost. So we really want practice. We want things to be fun so that people could keep practicing it much, much longer to really maintain any changes long term. We also want clear therapeutic goals because these support deliberate practice. They help maintain that intent, focus, and having that intentionality really helps us constrain and improve dosage. More practice opportunities because you know what you're trying to practice. The caveat here is that deliberate practice is good. We know this from the skill training literature. But self-consciousness can be very negative. And especially because we're trying to help people with aspects of language that aren't typically under conscious control. And so just like kind of an exercise to think about this. You know, I'm talking to you right now. If I start really paying attention to my tongue and my lips, things are going to break down quickly, right? So we do want practice with clear intent, but don't worry, we'll definitely work with you and help you to set meaningful goals at the right level. One design challenge here when we're thinking about repeated practice opportunities is typically, group games can be very engaging. There are thriving aphasia communities out there in the world that we're really hoping to help. But the more members you have together in an aphasia group, the less practice opportunities for each member. So the challenge here is, are there ways to design opportunities for multiple players to get lots of practice? Just something to think about. So the second main ingredient we really want to focus on is providing performance feedback. So when players get feedback about the success of their attempts, it promotes learning and retention. This should be relatively easy to work into game design. And just to be thorough, it's not all learning requires explicit feedback. There are some airless learning approaches that are used sometimes to help people with aphasia. But it's just helpful in general for most of the things that you might target, and it's just a really useful design constraint. So we're just going to focus on that here. Make sure that there's some way in the games for clear performance feedback. And the third main ingredient is to make sure to adjust the task to maintain desirable difficulty. So finding the right balance between level of effort, task difficulty, and the chance of success is important to maximize learning and successful behavioral change. It's also important the level of challenge is crucial to maintaining feelings of competence and overall player motivation. If something's too easy, it can become really boring over time. If something's too hard, it can become really frustrating. So, another thing to consider is that increasing effort promotes better learning and retention, but producing too many errors can increase frustration and actually reduce learning performance. This is, as if people start to learn errors, we'll talk a little bit about this later, but that could kind of increase processing interference so that the next time you try, if you've been producing an error and learning it, it might be more likely that that's what you retrieve from memory. So one framework that my lab has developed, we call the BEARS treatment framework, not just because acronyms are fun, but because it's about balancing effort, accuracy, and response speed during treatment. The idea here is that an individual sweet spot is the one that balances these factors to best maintain desirable difficulty. And so something to tie in here for a design challenge is, remember, different people with aphasia have very different language profiles and abilities. You may be designing games that intentionally bring together players who have aphasia and players who don't. So the question is, how will your game maintain desirable difficulty for as many different types of players as possible, even as they improve in their abilities over time through practicing the game? And also, can you incorporate play asymmetry and adaptive elements to support these overall goals? More things to think about. So, regardless of the exact therapeutic goal or goals that you may be targeting, it's really important to consider players' cognitive linguistic systems. One way to think about this is design with a processing model in mind, really thinking about what somebody has to go through cognitively and linguistically. So one way to think about this is, in this moment of communication for this individual, what are their cognitive and linguistic processing demands? What input or output are they trying to understand or produce? And in this moment, will this processing succeed? Why or why not? What's going on at the system level? One way to think about this is, given task performance, will it succeed or not, is usually determined by player ability in cognitive linguistic terms and task complexity in cognitive linguistic terms. And two key capacities here that kind of affect this equation, thinking about processing bandwidth and the ability to resolve processing interference. Now, these capacities are kind of general concepts, but they might vary for an individual depending on the domain and type of processing. So somebody with aphasia might have relatively intact processing bandwidth for visuospatial processing, but really impaired bandwidth for verbal skills or difficulty resolving semantic or phonological processing interference. Don't worry, I'm going to actually explain what those are, though. So, bandwidth is this concept of limited processing capacity. Just imagine how frustrating it is when you're trying to watch a video on your phone with one bar, right? Not quite enough capacity. So the gist is only so much information can be consciously attended, actively remembered, or actively manipulated. And so you might have heard things like attention capacity, short-term memory capacity, working memory capacity. We can kind of lump all of those together here. in terms of thinking of design constraints. So many people with aphasia have limited bandwidth compared to people who never had an acquired brain injury. And this can be especially constrained for language. So bandwidth design considerations. Thinking about either input or output, how much the amount of language that's being processed, like sentence length. Thinking about, and also so starting to be in non-linguistic terms, how many game elements can your players pay attention to or hold in their heads at the same time? What are you asking of them? And also one thing to think about is rule complexity, especially early on. So when somebody's learning a game rules actually require a ton of processing bandwidth. But ideally over time, as people learn the rules and it becomes more automatic, the more automatic level of processing, the less bandwidth it tends to take. So this is something to really consider when you're designing games is that, well, okay, things will people should be able to learn this over time, but that's going to have a huge impact on what somebody with aphasia might be able to do early on. So how do we support that? How do we make sure things are fun right from the start, but that remain challenging? Fun design problems to think about. So another key capacity is thinking about the ability to resolve processing interference. This is often thought of in terms of inhibition as well. And so one classic example is the Stroop task. And so here, there's words printed on a page. There are different colored fonts. If I tell you to just read the words, it's pretty easy. That's a low interference task. But if I tell you to ignore the word and just tell me what color the word is printed in, all of a sudden you can be dealing with a lot of interference. It won't be so bad in a congruent trial where the word blue is written in blue text. Those line up. But if I have to ignore that other blue that's in yellow font, there's a lot of interference to resolve. And so people with aphasia often show difficulty with semantic or phonological processing interference. And they'll often make speech errors in these areas. So they might be trying to produce one word, and so cup, and they'll say, a closely related word, so semantically related like glass, or a phonologically related word like cup. Maybe even a non-word like tup. And so a design consideration here, you can increase or decrease the amount of task interference based on your game design needs and consideration of player ability. So this is a tiny aside, but I think it's important to consider. Our best understanding is that aphasia is a language access problem. So there are certain types of dementia that can cause language problems, and sometimes it's better to understand that underlying knowledge of language is actually being lost. But in post-stroke aphasia, we have good reason to believe that knowledge of language is still in there, it's still intact, but people with aphasia have difficulty accessing, retrieving, and combining key elements of language in the moment, especially in a timely fashion. And so what causes the communication breakdown, what causes these language deficits, isn't that the language isn't there, it's that it can't be brought together online in that moment. Some evidence for this is that people with aphasia often respond really well to cues or priming. And so with the right cue, they might be able to produce language that they can't produce on their own. What that tells us is that it's still in there. The underlying language is still available to be accessed with the right support and practice. And so for us, improving access to language in context of increasing independence, so pulling back those supports, is actually one of the key mechanisms of action in aphasia rehab, because it's still in there. You're trying to help it come back together. You're trying to make those connections come back. So thinking about linguistic design considerations, let's go back for a minute and think about the sorts of difficulties somebody with aphasia might have, right? And so there can be problems understanding input, so comprehension, and this can, so reading or listening. Can they understand single words, sentences? Can they read a book? Can they follow conversation? Or on the output side, can they produce, say or write single words, sentences, paragraphs, monologues, right? Thinking about where somebody's breaking down and why is really important if we're trying to figure out how best to help them. And so, with that reminder in mind, here's a nice little laundry list of ways we can modify task difficulty. So, one way to do it would be to modify the performance goal and thinking about bandwidth and capacity. Well, maybe 3 words, they can produce 3-word sentences now. That's not challenging, but maybe 5 words is still pretty tough. So you can modify targets and performance goals. Another thing you can do is, especially if people have to process things on your cards, things from other players, is intentionally modifying stimulant complexity is another thing that you can play with. So the word length, or thinking about vocabulary level, thinking about the amount of content that has to be processed at once, the interference that has to be processed. So people with aphasia, many of them would have a lot of trouble with something like that Stroop task. And you have to decide, or when we can decide together, the whole team, whether that kind of interference would really be therapeutic or not. But it's certainly something that can be manipulated. Other things that are easy to shift around are modifying pacing, processing speed or amount of time given, presence of time pressure. This is something that's very difficult for a lot of people with aphasia. One of our aphasia community experts, Trish, talks a lot about the yips for aphasia, where when people are under pressure, people with aphasia feel that language performance tends to be very, very negatively affected by that. So that's something that we can offer that space to make things easier, or there might be fun ways to increase that pressure in a way that lets it be workable. Another way to modify task difficulty is with support via cueing, right? We can think of these in kind of like hints or clues, right? So you might have semantic cueing. Oh, you can't come up with that word. Well, it's a type of bird. Or you saw it yesterday, right? Phonological cues. So it could be for the sound. So it starts with a p sound, or it rhymes with edible. And then other types of clues. So like providing parts of a target. Think like hangman, or even the full target for repetition. That can be really helpful, especially if somebody's having a hard time, where you give chances for repetition and then let them afterwards, after that's been encoded, then have opportunities for independent practice. Other ways to modify task difficulty is to provide strategies, or ask people with aphasia to come up with their own. The takeaway in all of this is that desirable difficulty requires finding ways to match task complexity with individuals' processing ability. And there are definitely fun and dynamic ways to do this. One helpful rehab design framework I just want to throw out there, this might be very helpful in thinking about how to design games, is the Rehabilitation Treatment Specification System. And so here, this model of thinking through is for therapists and rehab researchers to really think about treatment design selection and why you're doing what you're doing and what it's made out of. So thinking in terms of therapy ingredients, thinking about why those ingredients are thought to have a mechanism of action, why should they work, and thinking about what kind of changes they're trying to achieve. I think this could be a very helpful framework to thinking through therapeutic goals for aphasia games for health. And so, moving on, that's all the content. I wanted to give some examples. Thinking through, first, a couple of language-based games, thinking about those, about how they make use of these different kind of design parameters for people who don't have aphasia. And then we'll talk about a couple actual evidence-based aphasia treatments using a similar perspective. So for the first couple, I think most people have probably heard about the game Taboo. But the gist here is that players take turns and they need to get the people on their team to guess a target word. You can see on this card, like it says yearbook, without mentioning that word or a number of very highly related words. So the ones on this card would be photos, class, sign, memory, school. Right, and so thinking about how this design creates desirable difficulty for people who don't have aphasia, right? This is hard for neurotypical individuals. So here, high processing bandwidth requirements come from having to remember what not to say, right? Because if you say any of those words, you lose the round, right? So there you have to hold those in memory and then remember not to say them. So that requires lots of inhibition, requires lots of bandwidth, self-monitoring. And the very act of holding those in memory leads to increased processing interference, because once those words are active, it's hard to think about all the other words you might say. The rounds are timed, so you only have, I forget, it's like 1 minute or 3 minutes or something. So you only have a certain amount of time to do this, which also increases processing demands. Just one other little side that's kind of interesting about Taboo is this act of what people are being asked to do. So can you get people to understand this target, even though you can't say it in this moment? That's actually a strategy that we try to help people with aphasia learn, called circumlocution. So often they'll have something that they're thinking of clearly that they can't say. And so we'll try to help people think, well, is there another way that you can express it? Can you think of another word for it? Can you talk around it? Interesting how a lot of these things line up. So the second game is maybe one people haven't heard of as often, called anomia. Anomia is actually a medical term for word finding difficulty, and that's a hallmark for pretty much everybody who has aphasia, has at least some difficulty retrieving and using the words. It's going to be really frustrating because, for some individuals, they can actually say that word in their head, they can't get it out in that moment. But it's a little bit of an aside. The game Anomia, the gist here is that players take turns drawing cards that have a symbol and a category on them, and they leave them face up in front. So when a player draws a card that matches the symbol of another player's card, then they have this race, kind of like war, where each then has to name a word, an example of the other player's category first. And so whoever completes producing their example before the other one wins that card. Thinking about how this creates desirable difficulty. So there's time pressure here as well, but it's created through inter-player competition. So you're racing against up here. Increased processing bandwidth comes from having to monitor symbol matches. Oh, look, I've got a circle in front of me. Does anybody have is a circle coming up? And that, which is even harder because they have these kind of rule shift cards that come up. All the while, if you're trying to win, you're often trying to think about the categories that are in front of you because it's really hard to do in the moment. And what's really interesting about this game is that under these contexts of increased processing difficulty, people, neurotypical individuals without aphasia actually display anomia. They display this type of word-finding difficulty that people with aphasia experience pretty much every day. Just something interesting to think about how all these pieces relate. Now I just want to tell you about a couple of aphasia treatments, and again, think about these in cognitive linguistic terms. And so one treatment is called response elaboration training. The gist behind this treatment, at least one version, is that people with aphasia are presented with a picture and asked to describe it. And then they work back and forth with the SLP to really try to improve utterance length, complexity, discourse production. The target of this treatment is to improve spoken discourse production. And so the way that works is that, you might show a picture like this, and the person with aphasia says something like, man. Like the SLP would say, oh, okay, yeah, I see a man. What is he doing? And the person with aphasia, this is an individual who has a lot of difficulty with spoken output. It's very effortful. Might say, dishes. Oh, okay. What is the man doing with the dishes? Washing. Oh, the man. So here's what I've heard: man, washing. And what was the last? Dishes. Okay. Can you put those three together for me? Right. And then let's see. Well, what else is going on in the picture? Right. So the idea here, thinking about the ingredients of a treatment like this, is there's clinician feedback, there's questions and expansion, there's modeling, there's back and forth, there's opportunities for repetition. And that one key thing here is that a lot of the verbal output for the person with aphasia is self-initiated. So it's their ideas, their language that's just being expanded upon. That's different from a lot of aphasia therapies, at least these traditional restorative ones, where it's like, okay, let's train this word. I'll show you the picture of this word. We'll figure out how to practice it together in the right way. Whereas this is really intentionally patient-initiated. And so the hypothesized mechanisms of action here are via the questions, expansions, and repetition keep pushing bandwidth limitations to increase the potential utterance length. And the thought is that repeated practice for word retrieval in like a loosely structured task with patient-initiated productions is thought to much more closely match natural conversation. And therefore, this is thought to generalize better to real-world communication than some of the more structured drill tasks that are common. And so thinking about this, about why that might generalize, brings up another design challenge. So can you design a game where improvements generalize outside the game context? Because what we know from the aphasia and the learning literature is that brains are really good at getting better at exactly what they're being trained to do. It's much, much harder to help engender improvement that then shows up in other contexts. So true generalization, knowledge transfer. If you can design games that help accomplish that, will have a much bigger impact. And so the other treatment I wanted to just provide as an example is called constraint-induced aphasia therapy. One of the reasons I talked about this one is it's much more constrained and circumscribed, but it's actually intentionally presented as an aphasia game even in the clinic. And so the gist of this one is it's kind of like a modified Go Fish game where there's visual barriers, players have cards that have matches, and people can't see one another's cards. And so in order to ask if somebody has one of your cards, the player must describe the target verbally without using any other means of communication like gesture or writing. And that, again, thinking about desirable individualized difficulty, depending on an individual's profile, cards might have, the set of cards that people are working with might have lots of semantic distractors, things that are very closely related in meaning, maybe all from one category. They might have a lot of phonological distractors, so words that are spelled have lots of similar sounds. And that the typical way this is done is very intensive, like 3 hours a day. The treatment target here is to improve spoken production, and that, again, depending on the individual and the exact design, that might be for single words or sentences, right? Depends on the cards. Ingredients here for it would be, so it's a barrier task. There's this intentional forced use of language. There's both verbal comprehension and production because you have more than one player role. You have to deal potentially with retrieval interference, and there's very intentionally lots of intensive practice. So lots of practice opportunities. And so the hypothesized mechanisms of action here is a force-constrained use of language under intensive practice context is thought to specifically target the language system for improvement and kind of overcome learned disuse. This is actually based on therapy, so constraint-induced like motor therapies. So stroke survivors often have hemiparesis or other weakness on one side of the body. And that what can happen naturally is that if one of your arms doesn't do what you'd like it to as easily, it's really natural to start relying on your good arm. And this idea, the thought is that learned disuse makes it much harder to improve in ways that are possible for your system. That basic concept was applied to language. But one thing that's interesting here is that the evidence is a little bit more equivocal, right? So that there's actually evidence that this constraint-induced about only using language, not using gesture or other modalities for communication, may not be specifically helpful. So the one thing to keep in mind here is that we're thinking about the system, we have hypothesized mechanisms for action, but the exact details might be up for debate. And we can talk about any specific elements of your design to make sure that they're most consistent with the rehab literature we understand. So here's a little summary slide about key design takeaways thinking about aphasia rehab. So it's important to provide gaming contexts that provide repeated practice and performance feedback that maintain desirable difficulty for individuals even as their abilities improve over time, and for different players with very different levels and abilities. Want to make sure that we provide game contexts that allow plenty of practice accessing, retrieving, or combining key elements of language, that allow practice resolving key aspects of processing interference, and that let players work at the limits of their processing capacity so they can push and expand that. Other things is make sure that your games are designed to help players either improve language function, learn better strategic ways to adapt, or otherwise address barriers to successfully living with aphasia, thinking in the environment, the psychosocial factors, anything in that original graphic is up for grabs here. Thank you for your interest and help in Aphasia Games for Health. This is a fun and exciting way to help people with aphasia continue to improve and connect, and we're really, really happy to have you part of this process and part of this movement. Thank you.